Last we left Aht Urhgan, he had recruited Najalif to his burgeoning fellowship, with his group now numbering 3. Aht Urhgan had been searching within the Empire's furthest reaches for those worthy of joining the Serpent generals, but even he could have hardly suspected that his next addition would come from across the ocean. To begin this remarkable story, we must go back in time almost 20 years to the era of the Crystal War, and to the Middlelands it was waged in. Bastok, as was the case with all the allied forces, found themselves besieged by beastmen armies led by the Shadow Lord. The unexpected united front almost brought the nations of the enlightened races to ruin, and if it were not for the actions of certain heroes, the Vanadil of today would indeed look very different. Our series has previously explored the experience of Bastok in this conflict through the lens of the Mithril Musketeers and the Dark Knight Zed, but this time we find ourselves following the tale of another Galkan hero, Zazarg. To say that Prefectus Zazarg makes a distinct impression of those he crosses paths with is a massive understatement. Possessing a keen tactical mind, stellar leadership ability, and trained by Bastok's finest martial artists, Zazarg cuts the figure of a distinguished officer. Revered to a near mythical status by those who served under him, and feared by all beastmen no matter their banner, the life and career of Zazarg, especially when set against the background of Bastok's history of racial unrest, is really remarkable. Zazarg began among the ranks of the Bastokan regulars in peacetime, but unlike Zed, who had enlisted in the exclusively Galkan 13th Regiment, Zazarg saw through the unit's formation as a propaganda stunt, and instead joined the 4th Division comprised entirely of Humes. Zazarg's great interpersonal and combat skills quickly broke the ice and built bridges. This was a feat made all the more impressive by the fact that the 4th Division was typically assigned recruits deemed hopeless cases or societal outcasts, and some who had even joined the military just to avoid a jail sentence. Zazarg's blunt mannerisms, disdain for political red tape, and hard but fair guiding hand resonated well with these would-be soldiers, and he turned them into an elite fighting force among the Bastokan army. So respected was Zazarg by the rank and file and officer corps alike that he quickly rose through the ranks and became the prefectus of the entire division, becoming a Galkan commander in a division comprised entirely of Humes. It has to be emphasized that the fact Zazarg was able to achieve this during a time of major civil and racial unrest is nothing short of incredible. Even when Galag launched a short-lived Galkan revolution against the Hume-dominated government, Zazarg refused to join the rebels, even chastising them for letting racial injustice define their being. For once, Zazarg and Zed saw eye to eye on something. Zazarg saw action in all theatres of the war, with his final battle with the 4th Division being in the frozen northlands of Zarkabad when the Allied forces finally put an end to the Beastmen Confederate. The 4th Division was disbanded following the end of the Crystal War, but with sporadic clashes with the Quadav occurring within the Republic's borders, Bastok still had need of Zazarg, and he was assigned the captaincy of the Gold Musketeers. Over the course of the next few years, Zazarg did as he had in the 4th Division, taking raw and occasionally unsavory recruits and turning them into a real unit. It seemed as though he could do no wrong until one fateful day. On this day, Zazarg and his musketeers were given a mission from the Bastokan Department of Industry to raid Palborough mines and chase out the Quadav who had taken up residence there. The Quadav had been harassing miners who were instrumental in rebuilding the nation's post-war economy, and where Gil was involved, politicians threw caution to the wind. Zazarg and his musketeers arguably went too far, exterminating most of the Quadav and sending the remainder running. They would not return to the mines for well over a decade. His actions invoked the ire of Pagdeko, otherwise known by his Hume-given name Iron Eater, and he summoned Zazarg for a meeting. Iron Eater berated Zazarg for his overzealous raid of the mines, explaining that Bastok, like Windurst after the Crystal War with the Yagudo, was in the preliminary stages of forming a treaty with the Quadav to completely cease hostilities. Zazarg admitted that he cared very little for the Quadav, having been at war with them for years, saying that he had seen enough crying children to last him 6 reincarnations. However, it did bother him that Palborough was a home to the Quadav, and that they had been effectively housebreaking and killing beastmen who had only been acting in self-defense. Zazarg was a brash and headstrong warrior, but he also had a good conscience. Even after all he had done in the Crystal War and all the enmity he held towards the Quadav, this was a bridge too far for him. He explained to Iron Eater that he knew that his mission was unethical and ordered for entirely the wrong reasons, but he still did it since it was his duty as a soldier to his nation. However, as it turned out, he had set a trap for the politicians. Zazarg knew that he and his troops were being used by corrupt ministry officials to turn a profit when the annual budget was allocated to the departments, so he saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. By giving the Quadav such an epic thrashing, he ensured that they would not dare return to the mines until mining operations were complete. Also, by resigning immediately after the mission, all attention would then be focused on the officials who ordered it, so the politicians would have precious little time for scheming when they were busy covering their necks to cause strife in the government. Zazarg announcing his resignation took Iron Eater by surprise. This was not what he had intended from this meeting. The Galkan community had lost two icons in quick succession, and he did not want a third to follow. The Tailkeeper Ralgrim had vanished during a Northlands expedition, and the Dark Knight Zed had also left Bastok to roam the lands. Iron Eater's plea fell on a mind which he knew was already made up though. Bastok would have a period of relative peace, and Zazarg knew that he would have no real purpose there anymore. He did not want to be stuck behind a desk. Zazarg was a warrior through and through. He had been for several reincarnations, he felt. He planned to venture out to find a place in need of his skills, and he had a good idea where to begin. Knowing that this was a lost cause, Iron Eater only asked one final thing of his friend Zazarg, that if Bastok found itself in peril, he would return. The news of Zazarg's resignation spread through the ranks like wildfire, and hoping to convince him one final time to stay, some of his soldiers caught up to him as he was about to depart for Juno. The troops' dedication to their commander was admirable, and at the core of it was the simple reason that most of them had been written off as hopeless and worthless when they were first assigned to his command, but he still saw their potential and genuinely cared about their well-being. Chances were that nobody in their lives before they met Zazarg had done either of these things for these men. He might have been the first thing some of them had ever known to resemble a father figure. They could not believe that he was leaving Bastok, but he reiterated his reasons for doing so, quelling any notion that he had been forced to resign. This was something he was doing of his own volition. Zazarg told the gathered soldiers that he had his sights set on the silent empire of Aht Urhgan, named such because of the empire's refusal to send aid to the allied nations in the Crystal War. This raised a few present eyebrows, for the reputation of the empire was low among the allied nations. It did not concern Zazarg though. He had heard stories of trouble brewing on the continent and thought that was where he might do some good by saving innocents from fates they did not deserve. A few of his troops said they would come with him, but Zazarg put a quick end to that plan, saying that their families needed them here in Bastok, as did the nation itself. He might be gone, but those he trained, his legacy, would remain to keep Bastok safe. Zazarg bid a final farewell to his men and set off on his journey. As soon as he arrived in Juno, Zazarg encountered his first hurdle. Although the Mahora to Al-Zabi sea route exists today thanks to the Ten Shodo, it is a relatively recent innovation. By the time Zazarg set out, there were no mercenary companies operating in Aht Urhgan, so he was instead recruited by the Ten Shodo. Zazarg was fortunate that nobody at the organization seemed to recognize him. He might have been an icon in Bastok, but evidently not so much beyond. This played to his advantage as few questions were asked. With no sea route available, one night an airship was flown all the way from Juno to the Wajayon woodlands, where Zazarg disembarked. Aht Urhgan employed a strict no-fly policy over its holdings, so discretion was paramount. Zazarg slipped into Al-Zabi under the guise of a freelance mercenary, using his obscurity to build himself a new identity and reputation. Sure enough, he soon made enough money to pay back the Ten Shodo for getting him there at great risk. As if fate itself had intervened, shortly after he had cleared his debt, the first officially sanctioned mercenary company opened in the capital, Salahim Sentinels. The Imperial Army had been made to resort to hiring mercenaries to bolster its homeland defences when the Beastmen attacks on Al-Zabi intensified. Zazarg leapt at the opportunity and, as he always had, rose quickly through the company's ranks, building a strong rapport with other mercenaries and proving instrumental in bridging the divide between the company and the Imperial Army. It got to the extent that Imperial officers would often consult with Zazarg on matters of strategy, an extraordinary accomplishment in the eyes of the Empire for a Galkan mercenary who had come from seemingly nowhere. Zazarg's star in Aht Urhgan continued to rise as he attained the rank of Major in Salahim's Sentinels and was then appointed the first principal of its officer training academy. Then something happened which changed the course of Zazarg's story. Although some of the officers in the Imperial Army were happy to consult with him, there were others who were not. They feared for their own stations and sought to remove him from the equation. Urhgan had experienced such problems with General Mishad, and Zazarg now found himself in a similar situation. A letter detailing Zazarg's career in the service of Bastok arrived at the Imperial Palace and raised serious national security concerns. Where exactly the letter had come from nobody knew precisely, but Zazarg had his suspicions that it had come from a jealous Imperial officer who had reached out to the Bastokan government, likewise not very happy with him, and attained his records. The Grand Vizier Rosvad summoned Zazarg to the palace and addressed the pressing concerns. Zazarg, true to form, was bluntly honest about his past, admitting that he was indeed previously the Prefectus of the 4th Division and the captain of the Gold Musketeers of Bastok. Rosvad appreciated the upfront honesty and was almost satisfied when Zazarg assured him that he retained no connections to Bastok, which was indeed true. Rosvad still had a concern though. If Bastok went to war with Aht Urhgan, what would Zazarg do? The answer again was upfront and honest. He would resign his post, saying, "I wish to shed the blood of my kinsmen as little as I wish to fight the empire which took me in." Rosvad was satisfied with the answer, as he said a soldier who would betray his own country could not be trusted in any capacity. He told Zazarg that his considerable talents were wasted as a mercenary, and that the Imperial Army could make very good use of him. This was the exact opportunity Zazarg had hoped for when he left Bastok behind all those years ago, and he accepted the position under one condition: that he be trusted as he would be a native of Aht Urhgan. Rosvad accepted the terms, and Zazarg officially became a resident subject to the Empire of Aht Urhgan. As the next year passed, Zazarg did as he had done time and again, taking those deemed lost causes and turning them into proper soldiers, rising to the rank of general in the process. Where he had only been a racial minority in Bastok, he now found himself both a racial minority and a foreigner in Aht Urhgan, but this did not seem to faze him. However, one day his unshakable demeanour would finally be put to the test, when one of his soldiers came to him to inform him that a group of sailors had bypassed Imperial Marine security and beached their vessel at the Alzabi port. Zazarg began to say that this was a concern for the Immortals. When the soldier continued that the sailors were asking for him by name, he was taken aback. He thought it best to investigate. When he reached the port, Zazarg found the same Gold Musketeers he had bid farewell to in Bastok years ago. They had travelled all this way for him for reasons he was going to get to the bottom of. The Imperial Marine who had been questioning the Musketeers released them into his custody, but cautioned him to be quick and discreet with whatever he was going to do, because if the Immortals got wind of what was going on, trouble was sure to follow. The Musketeers explained that rumours had reached them in Bastok that Zazarg had become a general in the Imperial Army, and becoming frustrated with the excessive rules and interference that had encroached the unit since his departure, they decided to leave Bastok themselves and join him. If the Musketeers thought this would have been flattery enough to win Zazarg over, they were sorely mistaken. He was not impressed. His final order to his men had been to watch over Bastok in his stead, yet here they were. Now both genuinely annoyed and concerned for their sakes and his own, Zazarg told them to go back to Bastok immediately before things escalated. Unfortunately, the Marine who had left Zazarg be a few moments ago had not gotten far before his own commanding officer found him and demanded to know what was going on. Zazarg's standing and influence even before he had become a general, and his rise thereafter, despite clearly being a foreigner, had been a sore spot for some for a while now, and one officer was going to seize on what he saw as an opportunity to be rid of a problem. It was a simple conclusion to reach in his eyes. Here was a foreigner enlisted in the Imperial Army, an officer nonetheless, meeting with his own countrymen in secret at the port. It looked very bad. Zazarg's subordinates arrived on the scene. They were not going to stand idly by while their general got arrested, and they prepared for a fight. Just as it seemed the situation was about to boil over, the city alarm sounded. The Mamulja had taken their opportunity to attack the capital. Zazarg wasted no time. He told his subordinates to head to the bastion and relay orders to take up defensive positions at the western gate. Zazarg planned to take the Gold Musketeers with him in the defense of Alzabi, but the arrival of Urhgan put an abrupt end to that idea. The last thing he wanted was for the Sky Serpent general to realize there was a foreign unit fighting in the Imperial Army. Mercenaries were acceptable, a foreign army not so much. To their chagrin, Zazarg ordered them to stay put. He told them he would come back for them, and went with Urhgan. Zazarg had fought beastmen for much of his life and had been in some pitched battles in the Crystal War, but the Mamulja were ruthless and savage even by those standards. Far more strategic than the Troll mercenaries, and despite their colloquial name, the Mamulja savages were a highly disciplined and organised force, and Zazarg knew it. Their army was comprised of units that specialised in one particular field of battle. This also meant that the mammals trained to undertake a certain task, and they could not be easily replaced should they fall, a fatal weakness in their armour. Zazarg saw through their plan. Their frontal assault on the western gate was a diversion, featuring their leader to draw enough attention. The bulk of their force, Zazarg guessed, was slipping away to the southern signal tower to infiltrate the city. Urhgan dismayed. There were literally no other troops to spare to send to the tower. Zazarg prepared to throw himself into the fray and face the mammals head on. He could try buy enough time for another unit to head off the sneak attack. Before he could though, the Gold Musketeers arrived. To Urhgan's amazement, he had no idea who these soldiers were. The Musketeers said they had not come all this way just to watch Zazarg get himself killed. They were there with him. Laughing as he gave up trying to stop them, he rallied his men one final time, leaping off the battlement into the battlefield to the utter shock of Urhgan. The mammals might have been as shocked as he was to find this Galka and a handful of soldiers in their way, but they had no idea what they were up against. Bastok's finest reunited for one final battle. Word of Zazarg and the Gold Musketeers blunting the mammal attack spread fast among the ranks and the citizenry alike, and although the day was decisively won, Rasvad was not entirely impressed. He summoned Zazarg and the Musketeers for a meeting. Although he expressed his gratitude at the actions of the unit, Rasvad needed to resolve the issue that a foreign unit, unsanctioned by the Imperial Army, had entered an active combat zone in the capital under martial law. Zazarg had once sworn to him before he was granted his current position that he retained no connections to Bastok, so it was easy to see why Rasvad felt like he had been lied to. It may have well pained him to do so, but as the Grand Vizier, Rasvad had to make sure military law was adhered to. If this incident was not addressed, it would set a very poor example for the chain of command, and could potentially cause cohesion to break down very quickly. In accordance with the law, the unit had to be punished for their actions, but thinking quickly and noticing Urhgan also being present, Zazarg asked to speak. Rasvad may have heard this story before, but Urhgan had not. Zazarg said that he was an outsider in the Imperial Army and that he could not be more thankful for the chance he had been given. He also reiterated that he had once been the captain of the Gold Musketeers, a military organization which strictly enforces discipline. On that note, he claimed, there was no way that these men could be Gold Musketeers. The Musketeers here could never be the men he trained, for they had abandoned their duty to Bastok for their own personal reasons. Fully embellishing the show he was putting on, Zazarg then punched one of the Musketeers so hard he hit a wall and was knocked out cold. A voice of disbelief rose from the gathered Musketeers, but Zazarg soon shouted it down. They had to trust him here, as they had so many times before. As for the first time in his life, Zazarg was bending the truth. He had to twist the narrative to save his men. Falling silent for a moment, Rasvad admitted that they could hardly punish Zazarg for the actions of some wayward fishermen, nor punish the fishermen themselves for charges they faced. He had seen enough, leaving the situation in Urhgan's hands. The next day, Urhgan enlisted the services of a local mage to transport the Musketeers back to Bastok. Zazarg went to see them off. They apologized profusely and insisted they never meant to cause so much trouble, but with Rasvad now out of earshot, Zazarg admitted that everything had indeed turned out for the best. The Musketeers had saved his life by coming all this way and joining the battle against the mammals. Before they left, one of the Musketeers gave Zazarg a final parting gift, a Republican iron medal bearing the engraving 863 Crystal Era, Zarkabad. It was the medal he had received for his contribution in the Battle of Zarkabad, the final battle of the Crystal War. It was rare for Zazarg to be this taken aback, but seeing this old medal and what it meant for him certainly did it. The medal had been given to them to pass on to him by the person who had orchestrated their entire journey, Iron Eater. Now Zazarg really was lost for words. Iron Eater truly regretted the events which led to Zazarg's departure from Bastok all those years ago, so he sent the Musketeers to Aht Urhgan to either bring him home if he was miserable, or to otherwise give him the medal to cheer him up. Regaining his composure, Zazarg gave them a message for Iron Eater. Aht Urhgan and its people needed him now more than ever. He was staying. If Iron Eater ever deprived Bastok of its finest soldiers as he had done here, he would come back briefly to beat some sense into him. Then, with one final salute, the Musketeers were whisked away homeward bound. Looking on, Zazarg smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Urhgan had asked Zazarg to meet him at the palace once he had seen the Musketeers off. He said that the Imperial army was having a very hard time suppressing the rumours about what had happened. The command staff in particular were inundated with inquiries and thank you letters pouring in from the populace regarding the plate-armoured fishermen. His typically stoic demeanour breaking, Urhgan could not help but laugh, neither could Zazarg. Urhgan knew exactly what had happened, reading between the lines. The rumours would still make it very difficult for Zazarg to stay on as an enlisted general, but Urhgan had no intention of seeing him cast out of Aht Urhgan. They both knew there would be greater battles to come. Urhgan told Zazarg that he was in the process of gathering talented individuals to reform the Serpent generals at the behest of the Empress, and he wanted to offer Zazarg a place as his right-hand man. Urhgan was used to consulting with Zazarg on strategy already, so to him the appointment made perfect sense. Urhgan did not care that Zazarg was a Bastoker. His nationality did not matter. What mattered was his heart. This resonated with Zazarg, as his entire career, his entire life even, had been built on the belief that a person's race or nationality did not determine their course. Knowing that they truly understood each other, Zazarg accepted Urhgan's offer and became the Stone Serpent General. Zazarg would be a pivotal appointment to the Serpent Generals, with both his fists and his mind winning many battles and saving innocents. Zazarg's story is one of a person who never let circumstance best them, who never let their race define them, who time and again shattered preconceived expectations and did their best to lift themselves up, inspiring others to rise with them, becoming superior not to others but to their former selves. Join me next time for the final chapter in the Saga of the Serpents, as the reality and sins of Aht Urhgan's empire come back to haunt it in a way which will shake the empire to its foundations. The entire fate of the empire rests on a knife edge as the Serpent generals are faced with their greatest challenge yet, a challenge very much from within.